The air outside the fortress of Antonia still held the chill of night. A knot of temple guards and Roman soldiers marched into the forecourt, and between them walked Jesus, wrists bound, robe dusty from the Olive Garden soil, his face strangely calm after a sleepless night. Behind the soldiers pressed a cluster of about 50 accusers, members of the Sanhedrin, mostly Sadducees, Caiaphas in his robes of authority, scribes and elders hurrying to keep their dignity in the half-light. Judas lurked somewhere in that nervous crowd, and John Zebedee kept as close as he dared, torn between fear and loyalty. The Praetorian loomed above them, stone steps leading up to the main entrance. But the Jewish leaders stopped at the line where Gentile flooring began. They would not step inside. On this day of preparation, they would murder a righteous man, yet they would not risk ceremony defilement by entering a Roman hall where unleavened bread might have been baked. They clustered at the foot of the steps, shouting for Pilate. Inside, Pontius Pilate was already awake. He had been warned the previous evening. The priesthood wanted Roman soldiers for a secret arrest in Gethsemane. That meant trouble. So he was dressed, briefed, and waiting when the early morning delegation arrived. Pilate was not an incompetent governor. Tiberius would have never tolerated open stupidity in a province as tense as Judea. He could organize, administer, and on good days, rule with some measure of fairness. But Pilate was morally small. He never truly understood the people he governed. To him, the Jews were an irritating religious tribe, touchy, intense, dangerous in groups. He did not grasp that these Hebrews carried a living faith that they were prepared to die for, or that millions scattered throughout the empire looked to Jerusalem as the heart of their worship, and to the Sanhedrin as their supreme court. Worse, a series of early blunders had put him in chains to their threats. At first, he ignored their hatred of images. He let his soldiers march into Jerusalem with the imperial emblems of Caesar still fastened to their standards. When a delegation of Jews begged him for days to remove them, he threatened them with mass execution, confident that they would bow to the fear. He was stunned when they lay down in the dust and bared their necks, preferring death to idolatry. Pilate's courage collapsed before their willingness to die. He backed down, ordered the images removed, and from that day on, the leaders of the Jews knew his weakness. He made threats he dared not carry out. Trying to recover his prestige, he placed shields inscribed to the emperor on the walls of Herod's palace. When the Jews protested and he refused to listen, they appealed to Rome, and Rome ordered the shields removed. His authority sank even lower. Later, he raided the temple treasury to build an aqueduct for the city. Practical in his own mind, he was blind to the sacredness of those funds in Jewish eyes. Riots flared. Blood flowed in the precincts of worship. His administration strained with the resentment. Time and time again, to avoid complaints reaching Tiberius, Pilate yielded ground. The priests learned the formula. If he resisted, they threatened unrest. If they threatened unrest, he was almost always give in. Now, as the first light washed the Praetorian walls, all those old failures sat on his shoulders like invisible chains. Pilate stepped out onto the broad stone platform, flanked by Roman guards, and sat on the judgment seat that he had set up outside. Below, the crowd shifted, torches guttered, and Jesus stood between two soldiers, silently watching. Pilate raised his voice over a murmur. "What charge do you bring against this man?" The leading counselor had not planned to argue details. They wanted to rubber stamp confirmation of a sentence already arranged in their own court. So the spokesman answered with a thinly veiled irritation. "If he were not a wrongdoer, we would not have brought him to you." It was an answer that carried entitlement, not respect. Pilate's eyes narrowed. He knew they'd been up all night, supposedly establishing this man's guilt. Now they stood before him, unwilling to even name the accusation. "If you have no clear charge," he said coolly, "take him yourselves. Judge him by your own law." The clerk of the Sanhedrin stepped forward, voice edged with fury. "We are not allowed to put this man to death. This one deserves to die for what he has taught and done. That is why we brought him to you." There it was. Not just a trial, but a demand for Roman crucifixion. Pilate paused, stung by their presumption. They were treating their governor as a stamped seal, their court as a real authority, Rome as a tool. He waited. When they still hesitated, he refused to proceed. "I will not condemn this man without a trial," he said. "I will not even question him until you put charges in writing." Reluctantly, they signaled. The clerk stepped forward with a document. Pilate unrolled it and read, "He disturbs the peace and misleads the nation. He forbids the paying of tribute to Caesar. He calls himself the King of the Jews and speaks of a new kingdom." Jesus had not been properly tried or legally convicted of any of this, and he had not even heard these charges in Jewish court. Now Pilate had him brought closer and commanded that the accusations be repeated in his hearing. As the words echoed over the stones, Jesus stood utterly quiet. John Zebedee knew these charges were distorted. The priest knew. Jesus knew. Still he answered nothing. When Pilate urged him to reply, Jesus remained silent, calm, dignified, unmoved by the spite in these voices around him. Something about the silence unsettled the governor, the unfairness of it all, the majesty of the prisoner's bearing, the contrast between hatred and composure. Pilate decided he must question this man alone. Jesus and John were taken into a side chamber of the praetorium. The guards remained outside. Pilate motioned for Jesus to sit, and then sat beside him, an unusual gesture for a Roman judge facing an accused provincial. He almost began with an apology. He said he did not believe the first charge, that Jesus incited rebellion or tried to twist the nation into revolt. Then he focused on the second, a political issue Rome cared about. "Did you ever teach the people that they should refuse to pay taxes to Caesar?" Jesus did not argue for himself. He turned slightly and pointed to John. "Ask him," he said simply, "or any man who's heard my teaching." Pilate questioned John, the younger apostle. Steady but still shaken by the night's events, explained plainly that the master had taught loyalty in civil matters and that they themselves paid taxes to both Caesar and to the temple. When he had heard enough, Pilate fixed John with a serious look. "Say nothing of this conversation," he warned, "to anyone." John stored those words in silence. He kept them for years. Then Pilate turned back to Jesus. Another question burned in his mind. One that came not just from the written charges, but from whispers he had already heard in Jerusalem. "Now about this third accusation," he said. "Are you the King of the Jews?" Something in his tone, half sincere, half curious, made Jesus smile gently. "Do you ask this for yourself?" he replied. "Or do you ask because of what others have said about me?" The Roman bristled. "Am I a Jew?" he shot back. "Your own people and their chief priest brought you to me and demanded your death. I'm trying to find out what you've done. Tell me, have you claimed to be the King of the Jews? Have you tried to start a kingdom?" Jesus answered, and in answering lifted the conversation far above Roman politics. He explained that his kingdom was not of this world. If it were, his followers would be fighting to save him from arrest. His very presence here, bound and unresisting, proved that his sovereignty was a spiritual, a brotherhood of men and women who, through faith and love, had become sons and daughters of God. This salvation, he said, was for Jew and Gentile alike. Pilate caught enough of the idea to ask the obvious question, "Then you are a king?" Jesus did not flinch. "Yes," he said, "he was a king, but his kingship was of those who love the truth, of the family of faith, whose Father was in heaven. For this he had been born, to reveal the Father and bear witness to the truth of God. Everyone who genuinely loved truth," he said, listened to his voice. Pilate listened, but his soul was shallow ground for such words. Half tired, half mocking, he murmured the infamous question, "Truth? What is truth?" He had studied Stoic philosophers who called the wise man king. He could grasp that metaphor, but he could not rise to the spiritual reality standing beside him. Still, he knew one thing very clearly now. This man was no political rebel, no armed Messiah dreaming of the throne of Israel. Face to face, Jesus looked like a gentle, weary, but upright spiritual teacher, not a seditionist. To Pilate, he seemed almost like a harmless visionary, a fanatic, perhaps, but an innocent one. Pilate went back out and told the priests honestly. He found no fault in this man. The charges did not hold. The priests answered with renewed fury, insisting that Jesus stirred up people all over Judea, starting from Galilee. At the word Galilee, Pilate saw an escape. Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, was in the city for the Passover. Let Herod handle this thorny religious figure from his own jurisdiction. He ordered Jesus sent to Herod. Herod received him in the old Hasmonean palace. The tetrarch had heard many rumors about Jesus' miracles and teaching. He was not thinking of the earnest teenager who once had come to Sepphoris, seeking justice for a family debt. That episode had long faded. He saw only an opportunity for spiritual entertainment. He questioned Jesus at length, taunting, coaxing, demanding a sign, a wonder, a spectacle. Jesus stood silent. Herod turned towards the chief priests and the Sadducees, heard their accusations, and grew bored when the prisoner refused to perform for him. At last, in crude mockery of Jesus' claim to the kingdom, he had an old purple robe thrown over his shoulders, made sport of him with his court, and sent them back to Pilate. Herod knew he had no authority over this case in Judea. Deep inside, he was relieved. The man who had stirred Galilee was now someone else's responsibility. The shadow of John the Baptist still haunted his conscience. He had at times feared that Jesus might be John raised from the dead. Seeing now how different this quiet man was from the fiery prophet from the Jordan, his fears were eased, and Pilate's burden was doubled. When Jesus returned, Pilate again came out to the judgment seat of the assembled, both rulers and people. He repeated his verdict. Neither he nor Herod had found anything worthy of death. If the priests insisted, he was willing to chastise Jesus and release him, but he could not honestly condemn him to die. At that very moment, a large multitude began streaming up towards the praetorium. It was the yearly custom for the Roman governor to release one prisoner for the Passover as a gesture of goodwill. The crowd came expecting this favor. Pilate saw yet another possible escape. Offer them Jesus. But the name that rose from the mob's mouth was not the master's. They shouted for Barabbas, a notorious agitator and robber, a convicted murderer awaiting execution after the feast. Pilate stood and shouted over the noise, explaining that Jesus had been brought by the chief priests on serious charges, yet he found the man innocent. Then he shouted the choice. "Whom do you want me to release? Barabbas the murderer, or Jesus of Galilee?" The priests moved swiftly through the crowd, whispering, urging, steering the mood. When they cried out for Barabbas, the crowd shifted with them. The awe they had once felt for Jesus, the man who had cleansed the temple and healed the sick, dissolved now that he had stood bound and apparently defeated. The cry rose and hardened, "Barabbas! Barabbas!" Pilate felt his temper flare. How could they demand a criminal's freedom in the blood of a man whose worst crime was a spiritual claim? He made the mistake of saying it out loud, referring again to Jesus as the King of the Jews. To the Jewish leaders, whose hope was for conquering Messiah burned hot, and whose pride chafed under the Roman occupation, the phrase sounded like an insult, a mockery of their national dream. The response was immediate and fierce, a roar for Barabbas' release and for Jesus' crucifixion. Pilate hesitated. He knew Jesus was innocent. A just and courageous judge would have dismissed the case and freed him, but Pilate was neither just enough nor brave enough. Behind the crowd roar, he heard only one thing: danger for himself. Then a messenger pushed through with a sealed note from his wife, Claudia. Pilate paused to read it. She begged him to have nothing to do with the condemnation of this righteous man. He had suffered in a troubling dream about Jesus and was convinced of his innocence. The note shook him badly and stalled the proceedings, giving the priest more time to work the masses. They moved through the crowd like poison, securing louder calls for Barabbas and louder demands that Jesus be crucified. When Pilate asked what should be done with the one called the King of the Jews, the answer came back in a chilling unison, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate made one last attempt, an appeal to pity. He ordered Jesus taken into the courtyard and scourged. By Roman law, such flogging belonged to those already sentenced to crucifixion. Here it was, used illegally as a political maneuver. The soldiers bound Jesus to a post. Before the first lashes fell, they threw the faded purple robe over him again, twisting the wreath of thorns, jamming it into his brow, placing a reed on his head as a mock scepter, and knelt in cruel mimicry. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him, struck his face, and finally took the reed and beat down the thorns into his flesh. When Pilate saw enough blood and brutality to satisfy any normal hatred, he ordered them to stop and brought Jesus back out to the platform. There he stood, robe hanging in torn folds, crown of thorns piercing his brow, blood on his face, shoulders sagging with pain and exhaustion. Yet something in his eyes remained gentle and clear. Pilate gestured toward him. "Behold the man," he said. "I still find no crime in him. Having scourged him, I would release him." For a heartbeat, the sight shocked even the hardened accusers. But hatred has a way of hardening faster than pity can melt it. The brief quiet broke into an even fiercer cry. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate's voice sharpened. "Why? What evil has he done? Who will state his crime?" The answer was not a crime, but a theological verdict. The high priest himself came forward, eyes blazing. "We have a law," he shouted, "and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God." Pilate felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. His wife's dream, his own uneasy conscience, and now this claim. The old pagan tales of gods walking among men flickered in the edge of his mind. For the second time, he took Jesus back inside. In the quieter light of the inner chamber, Pilate sat, trembling, and looked at this prisoner. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "Who are you, really? Is it true? You are the Son of God?" Jesus did not answer. Pilate had declared himself innocent, yet had allowed him to be scourged. He was a judge who feared men more than justice. Jesus would not dignify that weakness with further explanations. Silence lay heavy between them. Stung, Pilate blurted, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the power to release you or to crucify you?" Jesus lifted his eyes and met Pilate's gaze with calm authority. He told him what every earthly ruler forgets. No man has real power over the Son of Man except what the Father in heaven allows. Pilate's authority was borrowed, limited, permitted from above. His guilt, while real, was less than those who betrayed and delivered Jesus, knowing far better what they were doing. Those words shook Pilate to the core. Fear of the Jews now mingled with the fear of the invisible. He walked back out, desperate to end the nightmare, ready once more to deliver Jesus back to the priests as a purely religious offender. But Caiaphas and the rulers had saved their most effective weapon for last. When Pilate showed any sign of releasing Jesus, the high priest stepped forward, where all could hear, and hurled the decisive threat. "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king speaks against Caesar." In that sentence, Pilate heard the future. A report to Rome that had sided with a man accused of royal pretensions. Already under suspicion for earlier misrules and riots, he could not risk another black mark before the emperor. Fear for his own position crushed the last remaining impulse towards justice. He brought Jesus out again and pointed to him with bitter irony. "Behold your king!" The answer crashed back. "Away with him! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked, half in sarcasm, half in despair. The chief priest replied with words that stunned even the crowd. "We have no king but Caesar." So they nailed the national soul to Roman power rather than acknowledge the Son of God standing before them. Here stood the incarnate Son of God, the Son of Man. He had been arrested without clear indictment, accused without evidence, examined without credible witnesses, scourged without a legal sentence, and now was about to condemn to die by the judge who openly admitted he found no fault in him. Pilate looked at the roaring mob, at the priest vibrating with triumph, at the man in the purple robe and thorny crown, and collapsed inside. He ordered the release of Barabbas. Then, in a symbolic attempt to wash his conscience clean, he called for the water. He dipped his hands before the crowd and said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You are determined that he shall die. I find no guilt in him. See to it yourselves." The crowd roared back its terrible answer. "His blood be upon us and upon our children." The unjust bargain was sealed. Later, Pilate would recall to Rome, after another brutal massacre, removed from office, to live out his years under the shadow of this day, a man haunted by the death of the innocent one that he lacked courage to save. His wife, Claudia, would be drawn ever more deeply into the faith of the very man her husband had condemned. Rome made a grave mistake when they sent a second-rate governor to face the greatest moral crisis in Judea's history. But even in that failure, another kingdom went quietly forward. A kingdom not of this world, founded not by the decrees of Pilate or the cries of the crowds, but in the hearts of all who still hear that calm voice and, loving the truth, choose to follow it.